Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Tim Judah britanski je novinar i pisac, specijalni dopisnik londonskog ekonomista. Karijeru je počeo u svjetskom servisu BBC-a. Tokom 90. godina prošlog veka izveštavao je iz Bukurešta o padu komunizma u Rumuniji i Bugarskoj. Nakon toga je iz Beograda pokrivao konflikte uzrokovane raspadom Jugoslavije, ali i više područja sukoba u svetu i za različite medije. Autor je nekoliko knjiga o geopolitici na Balkanu, ali i o Ukrajini. Nakon izveštavanja sa Kijevskog Majdana 2014. godine objavio je knjigu Vrijeme rata, priče iz Ukrajine. Posljednju godinu od početka ruske invazije izveštava o ratu u Ukrajini.
Mr. Judah, thank you for your time for Al Jazeera. You traveled from Ukraine to Moldova and Romania to Sofia, where this interview is taking place. First of all, how is the atmosphere in Ukraine after 1 year after the Russian invasion?
I was actually there in Ukraine for 3 weeks before the invasion began. So today it's February the 24th. So today's exactly 1 year since the invasion began. But I was there for a few weeks before, and I travelled around the whole of Ukraine. And then what was so interesting was that the vast majority of Ukrainians were in complete denial that anything was about to happen. I mean, when you said, "Are you worried?" people would go, "Worried about what?" I said, "Well, there might be a war coming." No, it's not. No, they just didn't believe it. Then February the 24th, for the first couple of weeks, it was like people were in shock. And now, 2 or 3 weeks ago, I was in the east of Ukraine, and I talked to commanders on the front. And I said, well, there's a lot of talk about a big Russian offensive coming. Are you worried? And they said, well, we're worried about this town Bakhmut, which has been under siege since August. That might fall, but they could make a little bit of progress here and there. But in general, we're not really worried of that the Russians could break through the lines. And I said, well, why not? They've got a lot more men. They go, well, their men are not. Their men are badly trained. They're conscripts, they're convicts from the Wagner group. They're not serious soldiers. But, most importantly, they said, after the Russian retreat from around Kiev, then they lost a huge amount of territory which they had taken around Kharkiv, and then Kherson fell in November. It's completely changed the psychology in Ukraine. And as those commanders in the east said to me, they said, we lost our fear of them. So, exactly a year ago, I mean, people were frightened. Russia was the second biggest army in the world. They'd conquered Ukraine before. People were obviously extremely frightened. But after these big defeats of the Russians, admittedly with Western arms, but Ukrainians understood that they could defeat the Russians. And they could win. So psychologically, things have changed completely since a year ago.
So what are your predictions about this war? What are the options?
Look, I'm not going to make predictions because all the predictions so far have proved to be wrong. I mean, everybody was wrong. Everybody said, well, a lot of people said, oh, the Ukrainians are going to fall after 3 days. I mean, people were... the world experts on the Russian army got everything wrong. So it's really difficult to tell. I mean, it's also difficult to tell because it's still a kind of kinetic. It's still a kind of moving war. It hasn't. I mean, although the line hasn't moved very much since November, neither the Russians don't really have the force to move forward, and the Ukrainians, for the moment, until they get new Western equipment, they don't have the force to move forward either. So, in the short term, I don't think much is going to happen. But after that, I think we're still in that period where there's everything still left to play for, and that's why I think predictions are just kind of a fool's game. I think it would just be wrong to make kind of long-term predictions.
What do you think? Can someone now make a prediction what will be the fate of Russian President Vladimir Putin. And what about Russia? Is Russia an isolated country? And how the world will change after this war?
You know, I'm not an expert on Russia, but my colleagues and people that I know in Russia say that one of the reasons it's so hard to make predictions and answer that type of question is that Putin is surrounded by an extremely small number of people. So very few people, even in Russia, know what he's thinking and what he's going to do. And in that case, also, you know, how vulnerable he is. Today, February the 24th, there was an article yesterday in the Financial Times which said that on February the 24th, a year ago, that even Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, didn't know that the invasion was imminent and was about to begin. So, you know, if even people like Sergei Lavrov don't know, didn't know what was going to happen, it's really hard for kind of outsiders to make predictions. Today is February the 24th. Yesterday was the vote at the General Assembly, and 141 countries supported Ukraine. There were very few countries that supported Russia, so including Syria, Mali, and one or two others. But when it comes to this question of, you know, isolation, I mean, of course, it's kind of isolated from, you know, from the rest of Europe, from Western countries. That's not the case with China, with India, and, you know, with plenty of other big countries and plenty of other countries in the global south. So it's not as isolated as we in the West think it is. However, you know, I mean, a lot of its business and income have come from the West, and now it's been cut off from, you know, it's no longer a gas supplier to the West, and it's a decreasing oil supplier. You know, you can redirect these things. Gas is harder to redirect, but it's been cut out of the sort of big Western supply chains. So, you know, in terms of its, you know, in terms of being, yeah, it's being isolated from the West, but it's not necessarily being isolated from much of the rest of the world. But, you know, how that will play out in the long run, you know, we don't know. And I mean, to follow up on that, I mean, it seems a sort of logical thought is that some people are saying, oh, well, the Russian economy hasn't really suffered that much. It hasn't suffered, you know, it's been put under sanctions. But, you know, as you know from the Western Balkans, and I'm thinking obviously particularly of Serbia here, you know, when Serbia was isolated and under sanctions, you know, things didn't happen overnight. It took years and years. But I mean, in the end, Serbia was very ground down. And, you know, I think that will inevitably happen to Russia in a big way, you know, but it will take time, even if it builds up new relations with China and India. It can't replace what it's lost with the West.
Mr. Judah, you were reporting on Ukraine last decade, and also you've been covering ex-Yugoslav conflicts. And can you make a comparison to the situation in Ukraine now?
You know what? As a journalist, there's a very simple contrast and comparison. It's that this is the first war. This war, in contrast to Balkan wars, is that we can't cover the other side. It's not possible to cover the Russian side of the line in Ukraine. But, you know, in Bosnia, it was possible to be in Sarajevo in the morning and then in Pale in the afternoon. Even, you know, in Macedonia, North Macedonia, it was possible to be in when you had your small conflict, it was possible to be in on one side of the line in Tetovo in the morning, and on the other side, you know, in the afternoon. And that's a real problem, that we can't cover the other side to make a picture, to make a sort of complete picture. You know, we can know very well what's happening on the Ukrainian side, but on the Russian side of the line, we can't know.
What about the Russian propaganda, for example? How strong is it now in this situation, in this phase of the conflict?
In all countries, ranging from, you know, from North Macedonia to to Britain, to the US. There's always a sort of there's always a percentage of people who are going to believe whatever the Russians say. But the fact is that I think from opinion polls in countries that I've been in recently, like, you know, here in Bulgaria, and for example, I was just recently in Moldova, where I mean, a lot of people looked at Russia very favourably and Putin very favourably. You know, since February the 24th of last year, you know, people looking favourably upon Russia and Putin has declined significantly. There's always going to be people who will believe whatever the Russians say, but I'm not concerned about that. What I was referring to was the fact that just as a journalist, I can't cover, you know, both sides of the story, and I know, as you must know, that you can always have an idea of what the story is, but you have to go there and talk to people to find out what the real story is. For example, I just told you that I'd been in eastern Ukraine. If I had not gone to eastern Ukraine, if I'd been in Kiev, for example, I would have had an idea of what the story was, but only going to talk to people, commanders and soldiers actually on the front, and when they told me they were not that worried about the Russian offensive, did I realise, actually, well, I mean, I wouldn't have known that unless I'd gone there. But, you know, in 2014 and 15 in Ukraine, it wasn't like that. In 2014, you could cover the other side. So I remember very distinctly writing about two towns, you know, one on the de facto Russian side and one on the Ukrainian side, you know, to make a complete story. You know, people who were living 10 kilometers apart. But you can't do that anymore, which is a shame.
Mr. Judah, what was the hardest thing to report while you were covering the Balkans conflicts? And can you draw a comparison between war atrocities then and ones happening in Ukraine now?
I think you've caught me a bit off guard here. I mean, I've never had to think about what was the hardest thing I had to do. I mean, nothing comes to mind. I mean, I did cover all of the conflict, but I can't remember. I can't think of one particular thing, which was the hardest thing. And the second part of your question was comparing atrocities.
The war atrocities then
well,
and in Ukraine now.
I mean, well, yes. I mean, as we've seen, you know, as in the Balkan Wars, we've seen these, you know, terrible atrocities taking place now in Ukraine. And
Vukovar, Srebrenica, for example.
I mean, interestingly, you mentioned Vukovar. So I was thinking a lot about Vukovar. So just under a year ago, when Mariupol was under siege, there was especially people discussing in the Croatian press that Mariupol was the Ukrainian Vukovar and being systematically destroyed. And to a certain extent, that's true. And because I was thinking about that, this summer I did go back to Vukovar, and Vukovar has been, as probably Mariupol will be, has been completely rebuilt and restored. But you can also foresee perhaps that Mariupol will be a bit like Vukovar, in whoever ends up holding it, in that it'll be full of museums and memorials and cemeteries, but life will never really return, in the sense that Vukovar's population has never recovered. I mean, okay, the whole of Eastern Slavonia, but especially Vukovar's population has never recovered, and I can foresee that also for Mariupol, that you know, you can rebuild everything, but
with
you know,
Bosnia
will people
war
go,
maybe?
Sorry?
A comparison to war in Bosnia?
I mean, I think that there was more of an element at the very beginning in 2014 and 15 in the east of Ukraine, in the sense that you had, like in Bosnia, a kind of a mixture of a mixture of civil war and outside involvement. But I think that, you know, that in this stage of the war, I mean, it's not the same, because it's really kind of, this is Russia, clearly 100%. In 2014, it was kind of much more unclear, because there was this element of civil war. I mean, Ukrainians hate it when you say that, but there was that element. So there were certain comparisons. I mean, there are certain superficial comparisons, but when you look at it in depth, a lot of these comparisons, they don't really. They're just superficial, the comparisons with the Balkans.
You've been covering Kosovo for a long time. And is there a possibility for a solution in the dispute between Kosovo and Serbia?
So I think there are no disputes in the Balkans, zero disputes in the Balkans, which cannot be settled with political will. I mean, it's like everything can be settled if there's political will. I think that until now, and today's February the 24th, so until now, there hasn't been that will in between Kosovo and Serbia. I mean, there have been times, you know, in the last decade where relations have been better and, you know, agreements have been made. Whether they've been implemented or not is another question. But now, I think what we've seen is, as a result of the war in Ukraine, the EU and the US behind it have made a real push over Kosovo. So what we've seen then in the last 10 months, however, is that we've had these kind of endless kind of crises over number plates in the north of Kosovo, or kind of ID cards and crossing the border, etc. But, you know, today, February the 24th, in 3 days, Aleksandar Vučić and Albin Kurti are due to meet in Brussels. And I think, you know, when people see this, you know, this will have gone out of date perhaps, but I mean, as it looks now, I would have said that the chances of an agreement which will open the door to sort of further normalization are higher than they've been for some years. I mean, it may come to nothing, but I just think that there is a chance, yeah.
In your opinion, can profile of leaders such as Aleksandar Vučić and Albin Kurti can resolve the Kosovo dispute as a profile of politics?
I mean, I tell you, let me give you a kind of little anecdote here. Some years ago, the last time I did an interview with Hashim Thaçi, I finished the interview and I got up and he said, "Are you seeing Alexander?" And I said, "Who?" I didn't realise, and of course then I realised he was talking about Aleksandar Vučić. So obviously, you know, Vučić and Thaçi came from, you know, very different points of view and histories. But the fact was that I think that that Hashim Thaçi and Vučić, they were able to work together. They didn't hate each other, and I think this is a difference for various reasons. I think, which is, and also is relatively unusual. But I think that my impression is that Aleksandar Vučić and Albin Kurti actually really loathe each other. They really hate each other, and I think that does make it, you know, more difficult because they don't have that kind of personal chemistry. Having said that, you know, there is a lot of pressure, and if there's political will, yeah, they can make a deal. But without that sort of personal chemistry, it just makes it, you know, even harder.
How do you comment on the divisions in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and how this complicated political situation can affect the rest of the Balkans?
Let me ask a slightly different question. I think I'm not trying to avoid it, but I think slightly perhaps because in one sense there's nothing new in Bosnia, because it's like, you know, it's like, tell me when there's something new. But what has changed, I think, and what's interesting is how the war in Ukraine affected Bosnia. Because if you remember, in the 6 months, 10 months, the year leading up to, was not even a year, I think it was like, I can't remember, it was like in the period leading up to the Russian invasion, Milorad Dodik had basically decided that, had told Republika Srpska officials to withdraw from the state institutions, and talked about setting up or resetting up an army of Republika Srpska. And if Kiev had fallen within 3 days, all of that certainly would have happened, and a lot more. But I think it's very significant that after Kiev did not fall in 3 days, that all of that was quietly put aside and is not happening. I'm not saying it's not going to come back, but you know, a lot of bad things which could have happened in Bosnia didn't happen because of the ramifications of the war in Bosnia.
We've been witnessing a lot of euphoria after the Prespa agreement in North Macedonia, and people there thought that that will speed up the European integration. But now we can witness that people are disappointed, and we can witness mass migration and lack of perspective. In your opinion, why EU allowed this situation?
I mean, first of all, the mass migration is something else. So we're in Sofia, and I'm not so sure that the mass migration is less in Bulgaria than it is in North Macedonia. But I mean, I don't know the exact figures, but you know, mass migration from Bulgaria also continues. And the fact was that it was a tragedy that things didn't move faster after the Prespa agreement. And I think that...
But Bulgaria is EU member, and North Macedonia recently started the negotiation process.
Well, except that you have to change the constitution, etc., etc., etc. I think that people hadn't really anticipated the depth of feeling about North Macedonia in Bulgaria and how it would be used, and it was instrumentalized in Bulgarian politics. I think that hadn't really been, you know, anticipated, I think.
Can you see the guilt in maybe in the EU countries or EU politics about this situation in general on Balkans?
What about generally in Balkans?
Yeah.
I mean, you can always say that EU countries or other countries could do more, and that's certainly the case. But you know, at the end of the day, it's like people in the Western Balkans elect their governments just like everybody else, and at the end of the day, it's the responsibility of people in the Western Balkans and countries and governments in the Western Balkans. You know, you can, you know, the EU or foreigners can do a certain amount, but they can't do everything. And at the end of the day, it's up to leaders in the Western Balkans to solve their problems.
A few days ago, Vladimir Putin blamed the West for the situation with Ukraine. So, do you think that there is some guilt in the Western powers?
Well, no, because I don't think the Western powers invaded Ukraine. I mean, the Western powers were not invading Ukraine. So, I mean, Russia invaded Ukraine. I mean, that's just like blaming the victim or blaming somebody else. But that's just stupid stuff. No.
You've been working as a foreign correspondent from Balkans in decades. What is the perception of the rest of the Europe about Balkans?
I mean, it's kind of assuming that there is a perception. I don't think that there is much of a perception amongst ordinary people. I mean, I don't think, I think things may have changed a little bit since the wars. I mean, often people are still, you know, often people have a kind of remember things from the wars when Western Balkans were in the news. But it takes a long time for people's opinions to change. But I don't think that they have much perception, really. I don't think they think about Western Balkans very much. I don't think there's, you know, if you did some sort of, if you ask people about Western Balkans or today, name something associated with the Western Balkans, I don't think many people even would know the term Western Balkans, frankly. But if you sort of pointed them out to like, name something, people might say Novak Djokovic. I think that's what they would say. I don't think that there is much much perception, really.
Where does the Balkans stand in terms of interest between the great powers?
Well, I mean, I think Russia has certainly wanted to instrumentalize what it can in the Western Balkans, which is basically Serbia, at least half of Montenegro, Bosnian Serbs, and to a certain extent in Macedonia. I mean, and clearly to do as much as it can to cause problems, but it hasn't been particularly successful. But the fact is that because of the war in Ukraine, I think that put renewed interest back in the region to make sure that there weren't going to be unexpected problems, which is why we saw at least a slight increase in the number of troops, Western troops in Bosnia, and this big push recently to normalise relations again between Serbia and Kosovo. But, you know, in the end of the day, Western Balkans are not very big. It's got small populations, aging populations, shrinking populations. They're not that important in a sort of big global game of things. You know, I say Western, you know, to sum it up, Russia would, if they can cause some problems, some headaches for the West, they'll do it. If the West can stop that, then they'll do it. But, you know, let's not over-exaggerate the place of the Western Balkans in sort of world geopolitics.
Mr. Judah, thank you for your time for Al Jazeera.
Okay, thank you for inviting me.